Hey everybody, KMO here. Forgive the handheld methodology. What I have for you here is a segment of the upcoming episode of the C-Realm podcast. This is a C-Realm podcast episode that does not yet exist, but when it does, it will be episode number 546. The guest is David Blacker, who is the author of this book, which the title escapes me, but there'll be an image there in just a minute. Well, I mean, for you, it's there now. Anyway, here's about 10 minutes worth of an hour's long conversation. So you'll be able to hear that whole conversation in C-Realm podcast episode number 200, not 200, yeah, that was many years ago, 546.
That is one thing I like about Yang, and what I was attracted to some of what he was saying at the throughout as I've he's raising these issues that I don't think anybody else is raising, even Sanders, et cetera. I think there's almost a denialism about what's going on with automation and jobs and so on.
Well, Yang is the only candidate out of the 20-something on the Democratic side that I have any confidence knows anything at all about information technology or artificial intelligence or the technological transformation underway, which he calls the Great Displacement, but it has many fronts other than just how it affects people's ability to make a livelihood. And I just don't have any confidence that any other candidate, including my beloved Senator Bernie Sanders, is really all that conversant in these issues. So I
agree with you. And this book, I suppose, is focused on one of those additional aspects. It's not as focused on the economic issues as the previous one was, although that's kind of a premise. So I'm kind of taking off from really the premise. I'm not an economist myself. I'm not really making the case, but I'm sort of actually proceeding from that premise of displacement. And automation, and that there is a cost far beyond the economic cost to that situation, which has to do with people's understandings of themselves, our identities. That for so long, for previous generations of Americans, I'll focus on Americans for the moment. You can say different things about people in different parts of the world, but focus on the people that I grew up around. I think people tended to derive a large part of their sense of identity from their jobs. They were vocationally rooted with their jobs in the larger society and sort of understood their place in not just the economy, but in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in their families, as providers, as neighbors, and so on and so forth, where a lot of the anchorage and sort of ballast for that identity had to do with the job, the steady job. That was sort of the connector. And by the way, I mean, to have a pretty wide understanding of vocation here, not just, a paying job, but that this could include homemakers and, so on and so forth, where the occupational roles were anchored in certain ways. And I think under conditions of fluidity, or what the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, who I like a lot and influenced me in this project, calls liquid modernity. These roles and identities have become liquid. There's a Marx quote. He says, "All that's solid melts into air." And that's in a sense what happens when jobs become more precarious, less stable. Less the case that you can assume lifelong employment in a particular job or occupation, when mobility sort of continues to shuffle people around, where neighbors start to not know one another and so on and so forth. People start to lose that previous vocational anchorage in terms of their identity. And by the way, a parallel process of religious narratives loosening their hold over most people, I think, on the whole, over the last few generations, kind of adds to this sense of kind of rootlessness and so on. And what I argue in this book is that the current sort of craze for identity politics and the sort of some of the obsessions with identity politics should be seen in this context of trying to sort of almost, overcompensate for this sense of rootlessness and lack of connection to one another and to stable communities, because we latch on to these other identities, that seem to well up. It's sort of like And I have sections, actually a couple sections in the book where I refer to this process as a proliferation of identities. It's almost as if, we see new ones every day that we're expected to understand how to treat and to name and to deal with appropriately. Sort of like the magician and the scarves, trick, where the scarves are being pulled out of the hat and it never ends because the scarves keep coming. The identities keep proliferating, and so I think this process that's going on now of experiencing this identity proliferation is tied to the underlying economic situation, which is occasioned, a la Yang and others, by I think automation and other processes. By the way, I think you can come at that basic premise from different political ideologies too. I don't think it's a Marxist view. I don't think I think you can come at it from a kind of a right-wing view as well, in terms of traditionalism and automation and so on. I don't think it really is the property or purview of any particular political ideology, left or right. But I think the kind of grasping and almost hysterical overcompensation with these new identities on the left and the right and everywhere in between, and identities that don't have any discernible political affiliation. That I think this has to be seen in the context of this kind of vocational rootlessness that we're being increasingly, and precarity and so on, that we're being increasingly subject to. And what I try to argue here, because my audience is kind of, you could tell you could tell an analogous story about the right and so on, and there's particular, in terms of politics. My audience is kind of the progressive left, broadly defined here. And I think that the left has become too enamored of, I guess, a symptomatology of these identities, and with identity politics and so on, and has fallen prey to almost a kind of nihilism, I would say. I call it a hollowness in one of the chapters. And I think this is really unfortunate, and it represents an unwillingness, for the most part, to grapple with moral premises. Of if we're doing all this in inclusion and all this inclusion regarding new identities and so on and so forth, or new claims of identities, from race and ethnicity to sexuality to all kinds of disability, to all kinds of different identities, and ones that we're not anticipating right now that I think will well up in the future, and new amalgams and hybrids and so on and so forth. But we've been so focused almost on these process goals of inclusion, based on a norm of equality, I think, that I think we've neglected a discussion of substantive ideals of what is it, all this inclusion is, what are we including people in when we're including? What are we going for? What's the substantive vision? What's the meta narrative? What's the larger goal? What's the story we tell ourselves about our final purposes and why we're here and what the heck we're doing, in general? And I actually think that is the kind of conversation that's needed right now. And it's a strange thing to say it's needed, because it's kind of a long-term discussion rather than something that has a particular solution to Medicare or gun control or abortion rights or whatever the particular issues of the day are. But I think the progressive left needs to have a more substantive vision, and it's very, very much lost its way. And some of the most pernicious symptoms of this are, I think we see with call-out culture and deplatforming and canceling and so on and so forth, as almost the modus operandi of the left. And to me, that's not a recognizable left anymore. I think it's lost its basic orientation and lost touch with what makes it ironically lost touch with its own identity when it becomes those things.
Well, bloodthirsty fanaticism is no stranger to the left, historically speaking. The greatest loss of life in the 20th century was arguably, Chinese, Soviet, Cambodian Marxists basically just killing
Right.
people in mass. So it doesn't come out of nowhere.
No, that's true. No, absolutely doesn't come out of nowhere. The left has always excelled at sectarianism because of it's often been doctrinaire. It's been doctrinal and dogmatic, and excelled at sectarianism. And remember the great scene from Monty Python's Holy Grail of the Judean People's Front and the People's Front of Judea. That's they were making fun of the British Communist Party and far left. These are almost hallmarks of the left historically. In addition to, even more pathetically, circular firing squads and so on and so forth, a tendency to insist on, you could call it a cultic purity, which has caused a lot of external damage, but has also caused the left it also rendered the left largely ineffective in large swaths of at least European and Anglo-American history.
All right, that was David Blacker. As I was editing that, and there were a few edits in there, just to speed things along. No, I wasn't changing the meaning of David's words. All right, well, that was David Blacker. You can hear the rest of that conversation and the bits that came before in C-Realm podcast episode number 546. That episode doesn't exist yet, but when it does, I'll post a link to it in the description for this video below. All right, that's all. Oh, one more thing before I go. As I was editing that bit of video, and David was talking about the various types of, we'll just say ideological extremists on the left, particularly on campus. I wondered, don't people smoke weed on college campuses anymore? People who are so angry about other people's language. It just doesn't seem like you're smoking enough weed, kids. So there's my public service announcement. One Gen Xer to the post-millennials, Gen Z, whatever you all call yourselves. You need to smoke more weed and chill the fuck out. I will talk to you tomorrow.